This is a continuation of our series on the history of the American College of OBGYN. It is my pleasure today to be interviewing Dr. Warren Pearse, the former executive director of the college, who has been credited by many as being the greatest executive director that we've had and been most instrumental in the development of the college as we know it today.
Well, Ralph, I'm glad you're following me, so there.
It's a real pleasure to have you here, Warren. And for our audience, I think a few things I'd like to ask you a little bit about your past history. I won't delve too much into your boyhood, but I'd like to ask you when you first became interested in the college and active.
Well, I first became interested shortly after I went into practice in 1956 and was practicing then in Ohio. There was an active involvement of the college in Ohio through the people at Ohio State University. And it seemed to me that this was an important organization to get affiliated with. I don't remember where I had met Don Richardson, but at one OBGYN function or another I admired what he was doing and decided it was important to apply for fellowship just as soon as I could. In those days, you didn't have to be board certified, and so I was a fellow of the college a year and a half before I was board certified.
I remember, if I recall, that was in Gallipolis, Ohio.
Yes, it was.
I'm interested in how a young man from Michigan, how you got involved with Ohio State.
Well, it was a good job and a good practice location, an area that, in fact, was serving relatively low-income individuals, a good practice group, and it seemed to me like a good place to begin a career. Actually, if we had become involved with Ohio State, I would probably be there yet in Gallipolis. A number of the departments of the physicians in Gallipolis went to Columbus to teach at the medical school, say half a day a week or something like that. The OBGYN department at Ohio State at that time had no use for anybody who came from outside the area at all, and so consequently my desire to be somehow involved in teaching was frustrated, and when by a long train of circumstances I heard of an opening in academic medicine at the University of Nebraska, I dropped a letter in the mail one day to Dr. Leon McGugan in Omaha, Nebraska, and one thing led to another, and 10 months later I was in Omaha.
When you went to Omaha, what were your responsibilities in the department?
Well, of course, I did general obstetrics and gynecology. The first thing I was assigned to do was to get in and straighten out the outpatient clinic. And for better or for worse, I seemed to get it reasonably well organized, and everything got off to a good start. We began a clinic in high-risk obstetrics, which was something not much heard of those days, but it seemed to improve the care that we were giving to women, and things seemed to go on a roll.
How long were you in Nebraska before you became chairman of the department?
Well, astoundingly enough, in my mind, it was about 3 years. Now, it's much more a combination of being in the right place at the right time than inherent ability. I think the chairman, Dr. Roy Hale, was elevated dean of the graduate school of the university and went to Lincoln. They cast about for a chairman. They couldn't find anybody that from the outside that was really terribly talented, and so they turned to me.
And it was certainly around that time that you and I made our first acquaintance.
It was.
And I recall at that time you did some interesting research on the use of forceps and forceps pressures.
Well, your memory is excellent for a man your age, but that actually started in Gallipolis with a fairly innovative private practitioner who worked with the Battelle Institute engineers to develop a strain gauge on forceps to measure both the traction and compression that existed during forceps delivery. I carried that on to the University of Nebraska. It was much easier to do that sort of thing in an academic setting, and we developed some interesting results over the years, including newborn outcomes following forceps deliveries.
When you left Nebraska, you went to the Medical College of Virginia to be a dean. Whatever prompted you to move from the lovely confines of Omaha to the plains of Richmond?
Well, I think all of us in medicine at one time or another have had a mentor. Mine was a remarkable gentleman whom some will recall, Dr. William C. Keetle from the University of Iowa. And Dr. Keetle seized on me and after I'd been in Nebraska a few years and began to get me involved in the major national societies and organizations, promoted me in District 6 of the college, and said at one time, Warren, I think it's about time for you to be a dean. And when Dr. Keetle said that sort of thing, you said, yes, sir, and went and did it.
During this period of time, as I also recall, you were instrumental in really getting APCO off of its what at that time was considered by some to be just a social organization.
Well, APCO began, and indeed I remember it well, because the individuals who initially conceived APCO were Roy Hale, who was the chairman, and Jack Pritchard, Ben Peckham, Jim McClure, then at the University of Illinois, young people in that age group. And it was actually a group of people who were too young and perhaps a little too feisty to become members of the senior societies like the AGS and the American Association. And so they were regarded by some of the establishment as perhaps really pushy young people. But APCO began by meeting at the Dallas airport, and then a couple times in Chicago, once in San Francisco, moved to New Orleans and stayed there for a great many years. Has grown into an enormously effective organization.
And you, as I recall, were very effective in that organization as the secretary and directing the people into the right educational modality, including undergraduate education.
Well, like many things in the world, Ralph, they've changed a lot over time. When I was secretary of APCO, we worked on a budget of $6,000 a year, and the preceding secretary had actually failed to collect dues for an entire year because he forgot about it. Today, of course, APCO is a $300,000 a year organization with a great range of programs.
Well, now on to the college. From being dean at the Medical College of Virginia, you moved to Chicago. Tell us a little bit about what prompted you to be thinking about moving from Richmond now into Chicago and into the college office.
Well, you may not be perhaps terribly surprised to hear that I'd just come back from an extended trip teaching in southern Brazil on an exchange program with a group of physicians from MCV. And one Sunday night, I had a telephone call from Dr. William C. Keetle. Dr. Keetle said he was the chairman of the search committee to find a new executive director for the college, and he would like me to interview for that job. I did, along with a couple other individuals, and had another call from Dr. Keetle who said, he thought I ought to come to Chicago and take the job, to which I replied, yes, sir. One did that to Dr. Keetle.
Yes, we all remember Dr. Keetle very well. And I think he was a very wonderful gentleman.
One could have had a much worse mentor, yes.
Yes, one certainly could. Now, in Chicago, the college was located on One Wacker Drive. When you arrived in Chicago, what was your impression of the organization?
It was small. It had a budget of around just a little over $1 million a year, which was considerably less extensive, obviously, than I dealt with the dean of a medical school, and gave me some pause in terms of what size of an organization I'd actually have a chance to manage. It had been without an executive director for a year. I had some excellent people on the staff, and what in looking back now was certainly a relatively limited range of activities. It grew up, as did many medical societies, medical specialty societies, whose main activity was to have an annual meeting and a banquet and have lots of people get together someplace and hear a few papers by professors, and had just barely begun to grow out of that.
I have been told by others that one of the main reasons that the college is no longer located in Chicago was because Warren Pearse had the foresight to determine that if the college was ever going to be a factor in medical politics as well in the medical world, that it needed to be located in Washington, D.C. How did Warren Pearse get that foresight?
Well, and I think you probably overstate it, but I learned when I was at MCV that some of the most effective university systems had political offices in Washington. The University of California system had an office in Washington. It seemed to me as if our organization was to be effective, we needed an office in Washington. And so in 1977, we opened an office with 4 people in Washington at 444 North Capitol Street. And within about 6 months, it became apparent that without a physician in Washington, we weren't going to accomplish much. And Herb Nichols, who was then the director of practice, was willing to move to Washington, and so he did. By the time he'd been there about a year, it became apparent that in order to have an effective office in Washington, we were going to need a lawyer and a library and lots more people. And then pretty soon it became apparent that the rate we were going, we'd have a large office in Washington and a large office in Chicago, which looked like a silly way to run the organization. And so we began the preparations to move the college to Washington, including getting the executive board to agree to it. Now, there was resistance to that, coming primarily out of the Midwest and indeed out of Dr. Mixon's area, although it certainly wasn't anything he objected to. But there were people indeed in the Southeast who thought that this was not a wise idea. We would lose all our educational focus and be enveloped by Potomac fever. But indeed, move we did in 1981.
I remember that well, having been a section chairman during that period of time and actively lobbied by both sides. When you moved to Washington, we assumed our building at 600 Maryland, and that's where we function. We're now in the Warren H. Pearse building and have been there for several years. Tell us a little bit about how you determined, and I do know it was you at this instance that really located the site of the land and programmed us to our eventual move to our own building.
Well, you want to give me credit for a lot of things. I'm perfectly willing to share the credit for a lot of things because indeed it was our financial wizard, Mrs. Phyllis Talbert, who after we'd been in the building 2 or 3 years, looked ahead and said, there's a lot of inflation going on. Things are expanding in Washington. If we stay in a rental space, we're going to be the captive of the people from whom we're renting. We better start looking for land. The college's long-range planning committee agreed with that. We hired a firm to represent us. Now, most real estate agents, of course, represent the sellers. We hired a firm which represented only us and went forth and came up with an important series of properties. And we thought it was very important that we at least, if we didn't own a building, we at least had a substantial equity in a building, because this was just something that was going to provide us long-range fiscal stability.
And we now are in the Warren H. Pearse building. Tell me, Warren, in the years that you were executive director, and you served in that position longer than any other person in the college, what would you say were the major changes in our specialty?
Well, obviously medicine got more complex, and the major changes I think that we saw were, in an order that you might not predict I'd choose, were first of all subspecialization. That is the development in 1974 of GYN, oncology, endocrinology, and maternal fetal medicine. It gave our specialty a real base in basic research. It gave us a base in improved clinical care. I think it's driven much of the advances in the specialty, including its attractiveness over the past 20 years or so. Changes in funding have come along. We've moved from the solo doctor, the 2 or 3 people in practice, into ever larger groups of people. And so the business aspect, the socioeconomic aspects of medicine have changed a great deal. The third thing, and the last I'd mention, are certainly the legislative changes. You know, it would have been impossible for anybody in 1975 to imagine that people in government could determine who would be paid, how much for doing what, under what circumstances, let alone regulate what physicians could do to patients.
Let's take the Warren H. Pearse crystal ball. What do you see the future of our specialty in the next, if we won't take it any further than 10 years?
Okay. Well, yeah, OBGYN, in terms of attracting people into the specialty, has the I think, greatest advantage of perhaps anybody. We have a specialty that includes medical care, that includes surgical care, that includes the delivery of healthy babies to women, includes exciting research, a largely happy practice. And as you know, we've been very successful in recruiting people into the specialty. There's been a move, again, of course, to tell you what in the year of 1994, everybody recognizes that women's health is important in and of itself. It doesn't have to be a part of general internal medicine or a part of men's medicine. And so women's health, along with our specialty, is going to grow in importance. What's important for us as a specialty is to bring those two things together, and I think we will. By the year, let's take, as you say, 10 years from now, the year 2004, there will be about 30% more women over the age of 50 than there are today. It will have gone from 42 million women to well up into the 50 millions of women. What we're going to see in the specialty, I think, is a recognition of our role, that it's important to provide total health care to women at all ages, not just women having babies.
I guess one final question. When the move from Chicago took place, there was lots of talk about the college would develop Potomac fever. Now that you've had a chance to be there and look at it, do you think the college has even come close to develop any Potomac fever?
Well, I can tell you that in 13 years, the only embassy cocktail party I ever went to was one attended by the Washington Redskins quarterback, because it seemed like a good thing to do. I think we've been very careful to keep government relations important, but not overwhelming in terms of the responsibilities of the college and things like patient education and physician education and practice guidelines.
Well, Warren, we want to thank you very much for sharing with us a little bit of your history with the college, which, as I said at the beginning, is probably one of the most significant chapters that's happened in the college since we became a college instead of an academy. We thank you.
I count on you to carry the flag.
And it is my pleasure to be able to attempt to do that. Thank you.